In the Arizona territory of the 1870s, a place carved from dust and ambition, the establishment of Silas Blackwood was an oasis of civilization. The afternoon sun filtered through the large front window, illuminating particles of dust dancing in the air and casting a warm glow upon the polished wood and brass fixtures. Here, the raw, chaotic energy of the frontier seemed to halt at the door. The air was thick with the clean, sharp scents of bay rum and fine shaving soap, a fragrance that promised refinement and care. Silas Blackwood himself, a man of impeccable dress and a placid, reassuring demeanor, moved with a quiet, meticulous grace. His hands, renowned throughout the territory for their steadiness, were his greatest asset, equally skilled with a honed straight razor for a close shave as they were with the dental forceps for a necessary extraction. He was more than a barber. He was a pillar of this fledgling community, a bastion of order in a world defined by its lawlessness. Seated in the ornate barber's chair, a weary prospector named Jedediah Kane relaxed under Blackwood's expert ministrations. The man's face, weathered by sun and hardship, was a testament to a life spent chasing fortune in the unforgiving desert. For men like Jedediah, a visit to Silas Blackwood was a rare moment of respite, a brief return to the comforts they had left behind. The trust was implicit, absolute. In this chair, they were not just clients, they were patients, placing their well-being into the hands of the only man for 100 miles with any semblance of surgical skill. As Jedediah spoke, recounting a recent strike in the nearby hills, a glint of yellow caught the light. It was a single, prominent gold tooth, a proud and permanent declaration of his success, a status symbol more valuable and more personal than any coin. It was the prize he carried with him everywhere, safely embedded where no thief could easily reach it. Silas nodded politely, his expression a perfect mask of affable interest, but his eyes told a different story. His gaze was not on Jedediah's face, but was fixed, unblinking, upon the gleaming molar. It was a look of intense, predatory calculation, the same look a geologist might give a promising seam of ore in a rock face. For in the chillingly rational ledger of Silas Blackwood's mind, Jedediah Kane was not a man with a story. He was a walking mine, a fleshy vessel carrying a valuable deposit that needed to be extracted. The empathy that defines a healer had long since been eroded, replaced by a cold, insatiable greed that had transformed his perception of humanity. His renowned, steady hands did not tremble, but an almost imperceptible tightening in his jaw betrayed the avarice churning beneath his calm exterior. The client's trust was not a bond to be honored. It was a tool to be exploited, the key that unlocked the vault. The familiar sounds of the shop, once comforting, now began to take on a more sinister resonance in the silent theater of Blackwood's mind. The steady, rhythmic strop of the razor against its leather belt was not a prelude to a clean shave, but the sharpening of a butcher's tool. The gentle clink of polished steel instruments being arranged on the brass tray by his side became the chilling announcement of an impending, intimate violation. And beneath the potent, clean aromas of soap and tonic, a subtler, more persistent odor lingered. It was a faint, sickly, sweet smell, with an undercurrent of copper, like an old wound that refused to heal properly. It clung to the heavy wood of the chair and seemed to have seeped into the very floorboards, a ghost of a scent that no amount of bay rum could ever truly mask. It was the smell of secrets, the foul perfume of a grotesque harvest that took place in this very room. Now, over a century later, the site where that respectable barbershop once stood is a scar on the landscape. The building itself is long gone, consumed by a fire that burned so hot it was said to have cleansed the very earth. All that remains are the scorched foundation stones and a few charred timbers, skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The wind, no longer carrying scents of soap and bay rum, whistles a mournful, empty tune through the ruins. The local community shuns the place, giving the blackened plot of land a wide berth as if the ground itself were cursed. Parents warn their children away from it, their voices low and serious. The spot is a repository of a dark memory, an open grave that serves as a permanent reminder of the horror that once flourished here, hidden behind a facade of unimpeachable respectability and the promise of a steady hand. The cheerful sunlight no longer warms this ground. It only serves to highlight the depth of the shadows. Despite the warnings, The morbid curiosity of youth is a powerful force. On sun-drenched afternoons, children sometimes creep to the edge of the ruins, daring one another to step onto the cursed ground. In their hushed, excited whispers, they speak the name that has been passed down through generations, a name that has morphed from a man into a local ghost story, the Tooth Puller. The legend they share is not one of a phantom or a creature of the night, which makes it all the more terrifying. They speak of a real man, a barber and surgeon, who was a friend to all. But behind his kind smile and gentle hands, he harbored a monstrous secret. He didn't just pull teeth, he harvested them. He collected the golden smiles of the living, tearing wealth directly from the mouths of trusting men who sat in his chair seeking relief, only to find an agony they could not even scream about. How could a monster wear the face of a healer so perfectly? The story of the Tooth Puller is more than a legend. It's a chilling historical echo that proves the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we invite into our lives. These dark chapters of history have a way of traveling through time, their warnings persisting long after the fact. And as we prepare to open this forgotten case file, we ask you to mark your presence in our own ledger. Tell us in the comments from which city and country you are joining us in this investigation, and the exact time on your clock. Now, with your testimony recorded, let us wind the clock back to the Arizona territory of the 1870s. We will return to a time when Silas Blackwood was still a respected man, and uncover the first subtle crack that appeared in his perfect, murderous facade. The arrival of Marshall Owen Graves in the Arizona territory was an event of quiet but firm intention. He was a young man, barely in his late 20s, but his eyes held the sober resolve of someone far older. Unlike the grizzled, worn-down figures of authority common to the frontier, Graves was an outsider from the East, a product of a more structured world. His uniform was still crisp, his boots polished, a stark contrast to the dust-caked pragmatism of the town he now served. He had been appointed to bring a semblance of formal law to a land that often preferred its own rough-hewn justice. As he walked the single dusty main street, he observed a society built on a fragile scaffolding of reputation, a place where a man's good name was his fortress, and where dark things could easily fester in the shadows cast by unimpeachable facades. He was here to impose order, unaware that he was about to confront a type of chaos that wore the mask of civilization itself. His first duty was to introduce himself to the town's pillars, a ritual of diplomacy in a place where a badge alone meant little. He met with the gruff saloon owner, whose establishment was the town's boisterous heart, and the shrewd proprietor of the general store, its pragmatic brain. Finally, he was directed to the barber shop, the domain of Silas Blackwood. The marshal found a man who seemed to be the very antithesis of the frontier. Blackwood was impeccably dressed, his voice calm and measured, his manners refined. He welcomed Graves with a warm, disarming charm, his handshake firm but gentle. The marshal, a keen observer of men, noted the barber's hands, spotlessly clean, with perfectly trimmed nails and a steadiness that was almost unnatural. They were the hands of a surgeon, not a frontiersman. Silas Blackwood projected an aura of absolute trustworthiness, a comforting presence that made the marshal feel he was in the company of a true gentleman. It was during these initial days that the first official report landed on the marshal's small, makeshift desk. A traveling merchant, a cattle buyer from back east known for his boisterous nature and a flashy gold watch, had been reported missing. He had last been seen in town a week prior, making inquiries about a local ranch. Marshal Graves found the town's reaction to the news deeply unsettling. The consensus, from the old-timers at the saloon to the women at the general store, was one of resigned acceptance. The desert was vast and unforgiving. Bandits, a sudden flash flood, or simply losing one's way were all common. Fatal risks? The trail has a way of swallowing men whole, the saloon keeper told him with a shrug. To them, it was a tragedy, but a familiar one. For Graves, however, this casual dismissal of a man's disappearance felt like a symptom of a deeper apathy, an environment where a predator could operate without raising any alarm. The disquiet in Marshal Graves's mind was given a name and a face a few days later. A local rancher, a man named Angus MacLeod, known more for his thirst than his temper, stumbled into the marshal's office. He was a whirlwind of frantic energy and the sour smell of cheap whiskey, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and genuine fear. One side of his jaw was swollen, and as he spoke, Spitting his words with a slight lisp, Graves could see a raw, bloody gap in his upper gum line. He was the very picture of an unreliable witness, a man whose testimony would be immediately tainted by his reputation as the town drunk. He slammed a calloused hand on the marshal's desk, his eyes wild. "It was Blackwood," he slurred. "That damn tooth puller, he robbed me. He robbed me right there in his chair." The accusation was so outlandish, so contrary to everything Graves had learned about the esteemed Barber, that his first instinct was one of profound skepticism. Angus MacLeod, between gasps and curses, recounted his story with a desperate, frantic clarity. He had been suffering from a severe toothache for days, a throbbing misery in a lower molar that had driven him to Silas Blackwood's door. He described the sterile scent of the shop, the way Blackwood's calm voice had soothed his nerves, and the promise of swift relief. The barber had examined him, confirmed the tooth was abscessed, and prepared a dose of laudanum to dull the pain of the extraction. MacLeod remembered the sweet, cloying taste of the tincture and the heavy, pleasant warmth that spread through his limbs, cocooning him in a thick, dissociative fog. He was aware of the creak of the chair as it was tilted back and the faint, metallic clink of instruments being laid out on the brass tray, sounds that promised a necessary, healing pain. He had trusted Blackwood completely, surrendering to the promised relief. It was through this opiate haze that the nightmare began. MacLeod swore that while he was paralyzed, unable to move or speak, he felt the cold steel of the forceps not on his aching lower tooth, but on the opposite side, high up in his upper jaw. He described a horrific, grinding pressure, a violation he was conscious of but utterly powerless to resist. A sickening crack echoed inside his skull, followed by a surge of white-hot agony that cut through the laudanum's embrace for a single, blinding moment. When the worst of the drug's effects finally receded, he spat into the basin to find it full of blood. His abscessed tooth was still throbbing in his lower jaw, a monument to his original misery, but his prized possession, a healthy, solid gold molar he'd had installed during his prospecting days in California, was gone. The raw, bleeding socket in his upper gum was proof of the violation. According to MacLeod, Silas Blackwood's performance had been a masterpiece of theatrical concern. The barber had rushed to his side. Feigning shock and profound regret, he apologized profusely, calling it a dreadful, inexplicable mistake made in the difficult process of the extraction. He claimed the healthy tooth must have been weaker than it looked, and his instrument had slipped. To show his sincerity, Blackwood refused any payment and pressed a fresh, complimentary bottle of laudanum into the rancher's hand for his trouble, urging him to go home and rest. When MacLeod, still dazed and confused, later tried to tell his story at the saloon, he was met with laughter and ridicule. The consensus was clear. The drunkard had likely lost his tooth in a fall or a fight, and, addled by laudanum and whiskey, had concocted a wild tale to blame the most respectable man in town. Marshal Graves listened to the entire story with a practiced patience, his face an impassive mask. On paper, the case was non-existent. It was the rambling, unsubstantiated accusation of a known alcoholic against a man with an unblemished reputation, a man who was the very cornerstone of the community. To pursue such a claim would be to alienate the entire town and mark himself as a fool. With a sigh of professional duty, Graves formally dismissed the complaint. He advised MacLeod to go home, sleep off the liquor, and perhaps see the barber again about his original toothache when he was sober. The rancher stormed out, cursing the law and Blackwood in equal measure, leaving the marshal in the quiet of his office. The door was closed on the official matter, but in the marshal's mind, another had just been opened. After MacLeod had gone, the silence of the office felt heavy and significant. Graves found himself replaying the rancher's words, not the accusation, but the specific, chilling details. The description of being paralyzed but aware, of feeling the violation without the ability to fight back. It was a narrative of profound helplessness. He thought of the missing merchant, a man who had vanished without a trace, dismissed as another victim of the frontier's casual dangers. He thought of Blackwood's unnervingly steady hands and his perfectly composed demeanor. Logically, the two events were entirely separate, a missing person case and a drunkard's complaint. Yet, his instincts, honed by years of seeing the darker side of human nature, detected a faint but deeply disquieting resonance between them. The town saw a pillar of society. Graves was beginning to wonder what that pillar was supporting. That evening, long after the sun had set and the town had settled into a quiet rhythm, Marshal Graves stood at the window of his office. He looked down the darkened street to where the barber shop stood, a respectable silhouette against the starry sky. There were no lights on inside. It was just a building, silent and unassuming, its clean facade giving no hint of the grotesque mistake that had allegedly occurred within its walls. The official story remained unchanged. The merchant was gone, and the rancher was a liar. But for the first time, a seed of doubt had been planted in the marshal's analytical mind. It was a small, almost insignificant seed, but it had found fertile ground in the inconsistencies of the day. The question that would keep him awake that night was a terrifying one. What if the town drunk in his stupor had accidentally seen the truth? For a few weeks, an uneasy quiet settled back over the town, the kind of fragile peace that exists not because a problem is solved, but because it is ignored. The disappearance of the merchant was old news, and Angus MacLeod's drunken accusations had become a running joke at the saloon. It was in this atmosphere of willful ignorance that the truth found its first, unwitting champion. His name was Daniel, the 7-year-old son of a local washerwoman, a boy with a boundless imagination and a penchant for exploring the forgotten spaces behind the town's main street. The creek that trickled behind the row of businesses was his private kingdom, a world of smooth stones, minnows, and the droning of dragonflies. It was a place of pure, sun-drenched innocence, a world away from the secrets kept just a few yards from its banks, particularly behind the pristine rear wall of Silas Blackwood's establishment, where the grass seemed just a little too green. On a particularly hot afternoon, while chasing a frog through the shallow reeds, Daniel's eyes caught on a patch of incongruous color. Snagged on a gnarled tree root that dipped into the water was a small square of white fabric. It was too fine to be a piece of a burlap sack and too clean, despite its predicament, to be common refuse. What drew his gaze, however, was not the white, but the dark, angry stain that marred its surface. It was a deep, rusty red that the creek's current had failed to wash away, a stark blot against the linen's purity. His childish curiosity, a force far more powerful than any vague sense of unease, propelled him forward, wading into the cool water. His small hands reached for the snagged object, unaware that he was about to pull a tangible piece of the town's hidden nightmare out of the concealing mud and into the stark light of day. It felt heavier than it should have. As he lifted the handkerchief from the water, a few drops of reddish-brown water dripped onto his arm. The fabric was of a high quality, a gentleman's handkerchief, but it was saturated with something more than just creek water. It felt strangely stiff in some places, and the stain, now that it was out of the water, looked less like rust and more like what it was: old, dried blood. The water had diluted it, but at the center of the cloth, the crimson was dark and concentrated, a testament to a significant, violent event. The sight was deeply unsettling to the boy, who had seen his share of scraped knees and bloody noses. This was different. The sheer volume of the stain spoke of an injury far beyond any playground mishap. It was the kind of stain that belonged to the butcher's apron after a slaughter, not to a piece of fine linen found in a gentle creek bed. With a mixture of trepidation and morbid fascination, Daniel carried his find to the grassy bank. He sat down, the sounds of the creek and the town fading into a dull hum as he focused on the object in his hands. He carefully began to unfold the damp, folded square. As the first layer of cloth was peeled back, a faint but distinct odor rose to meet him. It was a smell that was both sweet and metallic. The coppery tang of blood mingled with something else, a sickly, cloying scent that reminded him of meat left too long in the sun. It was the same almost imperceptible odor that clung to the floorboards of the barber shop, an aroma he had noticed when his mother sent him on errands to deliver fresh laundry to Mr. Blackwood. Here, however, it was not a ghost of a scent. It was a potent, gagging presence that made his stomach turn. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to throw it back, but curiosity won the final battle. He pulled the last fold away, and his breath caught in his throat. Lying in the center of the blood-stained linen was not a lost button or a piece of jewelry. It was a tooth, a man's tooth, large and yellowed, but with a brilliant, unmistakable glint of gold capping its surface. Daniel had seen gold teeth before on the rare, successful prospectors who passed through town, symbols of wealth and pride. But this was horrifyingly different. It wasn't clean and solitary like the baby teeth he'd left for the tooth fairy. This one was still gruesomely attached to something else. A jagged, off-white fragment of bone, about the size of his thumbnail, was fused to its root. The sight was so alien, so fundamentally wrong, that his young mind struggled to process the grotesque reality of what he was holding in his small, trembling hands. Daniel couldn't look away. He stared at the jagged edge of the bone shard, noting how it was splintered and fractured, not smooth. It looked as though it had been ripped from its place with brutal, tearing force. There was no sign of a clean, surgical cut, only evidence of a violent, shattering extraction. Dark specks, like tiny bits of pepper, clung to the base of the tooth and the porous surface of the bone. He didn't know he was looking at dried blood and scraps of gum tissue, but he understood that he was looking at something that had once been alive, a part of a person that had been torn away. The gold on the tooth, which should have been a symbol of prosperity, was now a beacon of unimaginable violence. It was a trophy from a gruesome battle, a piece of plunder taken not from a pocket, but from the very structure of a human face. It was irrefutable, physical proof of a monstrous act. In that single horrifying moment, the world of Daniel the explorer ceased to exist. The creek was no longer a kingdom of adventure. It was a place where terrible things were hidden. The sun-drenched afternoon suddenly felt cold. The droning of the insects sounded like a warning. The object in the handkerchief was not a story or a game. It was a piece of raw, visceral horror that his young mind could not sanitize or explain away. A wave of cold, pure terror washed over him, a primal fear that bypassed thought and went straight to his core. It was the terror of a prey animal suddenly understanding it is in the presence of a predator. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, and he scrambled backward, dropping the blood-soaked linen as if it had burned his skin. The gold tooth and its horrific anchor of bone lay exposed on the grass, a grotesque testament to a secret he was never meant to find. He didn't scream. The horror was too profound, too suffocating for sound. The only impulse his body could obey was the command to flee. He turned, his small legs pumping, and ran faster than he had ever run in his life. He didn't look back. He ran from the creek, from the sickly sweet smell, from the glint of gold on the grass. He ran past the back of the general store, past the saloon's overflowing rubbish heap, his mind a white-hot blank of panic. His bare feet barely seemed to touch the dusty ground as he sprinted up the alley and onto the main street. Townsfolk turned to look at the terrified boy, a streak of pure fear, but he saw none of them. His eyes were fixed on a single destination at the end of the street, the small, unassuming building with the simple sign that read Marshall. It was the only place he could think to run, the only place that represented order in a world that had just been revealed as hideously chaotic. Marshall Graves was at his desk, poring over a map of the county, when the door to his office flew open with a loud bang. He looked up, startled, to see the washerwoman's son, Daniel, standing in the doorway. The boy was gasping for air, his face ashen, his clothes smudged with dirt and creek water. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it made the marshal's own heart quicken. This was not the aftermath of a scraped knee or a squabble with another child. This was something else entirely. The boy stumbled forward, his small chest heaving, and could only manage a series of frantic, incoherent gasps and stammers. He couldn't form the words to explain what he had seen. Instead, he raised a trembling arm and pointed, a single odd definitive gesture back in the direction from which he had fled, back towards the creek, back towards the hidden spaces behind the town's respectable facades. It was the most powerful testimony he could give. The marshal was on his feet in an instant, his earlier vague suspicions crystallizing into a cold, hard certainty. The boy's absolute terror was the catalyst. It was the missing piece that connected the disparate, troubling events of the past weeks. Angus MacLeod's wild, dismissed story of being paralyzed and having the wrong tooth pulled, the traveling merchant who had vanished into thin air, and now, a child so terrified he couldn't speak, pointing frantically towards the back of Silas Blackwood's barbershop. The abstract unease that had been gnawing at Graves was no longer abstract. It now had a location and a potential victim, and a piece of evidence waiting to be collected. The time for polite observation and professional skepticism was over. The seed of doubt planted by a drunkard had been watered by a child's terror, and it had just bloomed into a full-blown, monstrous investigation. Marshal Graves knelt by the creek, the tranquil gurgle of the water a grotesque counterpoint to the scene before him. The child, Daniel, watched from a safe distance, his small body still trembling. Graves used the tip of his pocket knife to lift the corner of the blood-soaked linen, avoiding contact with the saturated fabric. The object within was exactly as the boy's terror had implied, a gold-capped molar, gruesomely married to a splintered shard of white bone. The afternoon sun, which had moments before seemed so benign, now felt like a spotlight in an operating theater, exposing a violation so profound it seemed to poison the very air. He carefully folded the handkerchief over its contents, wrapping it in his own clean one. This was no longer a matter of suspicion or a drunkard's tale. This was tangible, physical proof of a predatory violence that had been hiding in plain sight, a secret he now held in the palm of his hand. Back in the confines of his office, with the door locked, Marshal Graves placed the grim evidence on his desk. Under the steady flame of an oil lamp, the details became hideously clear. He was a lawman, not a physician, but the story the bone told was unmistakable. The fractures were sharp and irregular, the edges splintered. It was the topography of a brutal, tearing force, entirely inconsistent with the clean extraction of a diseased tooth. He thought of Angus MacLeod's frantic, slurred story, of being paralyzed, of feeling the cold steel on the wrong tooth, of a sickening crack echoing inside his skull. The rancher's dismissed complaint was no longer the rambling of an alcoholic. It was the testimony of a survivor. The bloody handkerchief and its grotesque contents were the corroborating evidence, a single piece of a puzzle that hinted at a pattern of methodical, hidden atrocities. He opened his official logbook, the crisp paper a stark contrast to the sordid reality he was about to document. Dipping his pen in ink, he began to write, his hand steady and his prose deliberately cold and factual, as if the detached language could create a barrier against the horror. September 14th, 1878, he wrote, at approximately 3 p.m., I was brought to a piece of evidence discovered by Daniel, son of Martha Gable, in the creek behind Main Street. The item consists of a gentleman's linen handkerchief, heavily stained with what appears to be human blood. Folded within was one human molar, capped in approximately 18-karat gold, with a significant fragment of what I surmise to be maxillary bone still attached. The nature of the fracture suggests a violent, non-surgical removal. In the dry official record of the territory, the first concrete charge against Silas Blackwood had just been entered into history. With the evidence secured, the marshal's mind turned to strategy. A direct confrontation was impossible. Blackwood was shielded by an ironclad reputation and the town's collective affection. To accuse him publicly based on a single tooth found by a child would be professional suicide. Blackwood would dismiss it as a planted object or a bizarre accident, and the community would rally behind him. Graves needed more. He needed something that could not be explained away by the barber's silver tongue. He needed a record, a pattern, something that would transform a single act of violence into a systematic campaign of butchery. His thoughts kept returning to the gleaming gold cap on the tooth. The motive was greed, and like any business, greed leaves a paper trail. The gold had to be converted to cash, it had to be sold, and in a town this small, there was only one man who dealt in such transactions. The man was Elias Vance, the town's assayer. He was a specter in the town's social fabric, a man whose work required him to be both present and invisible. His small dusty office was a confessional for prospectors, where they would pour out their pouches of gold dust to be weighed, valued, and converted into currency. Vance was the keeper of the town's most sensitive financial secrets. His discretion, the very foundation of his livelihood. Graves knew that if Silas Blackwood was harvesting gold from his clients, he would need a discreet, reliable way to melt it down and sell it. Dental gold was easily identifiable. It couldn't just be spent. It had to be laundered, rendered anonymous by fire. Elias Vance, whether a willing accomplice or a terrified pawn, would be the key. He held the ledger that could either exonerate Blackwood completely or condemn him utterly. Graves waited until the moon was high and the town was cloaked in the deep silence of the frontier night. A public visit to the assayer would be tantamount to shouting his suspicions from the rooftops. He needed the cover of darkness. He walked the empty street, his boots kicking up small puffs of dust that hung in the moonlight like ghostly apparitions. The air was cool and carried the scent of wood smoke and distant coyotes. Each step was measured, his mind rehearsing the conversation to come. He couldn't go in with accusations. He had to pry the truth out of a man whose entire existence depended on keeping secrets. He would have to use the weight of the law not as a hammer, but as a scalpel, to carefully dissect the assayer's loyalties and fears. His destination was a small, unassuming house at the edge of town, with a single lamp burning in a front window. He knocked on the door, a series of 3 sharp, official raps that echoed in the night. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches, and the pale, nervous face of Elias Vance peered out. The assayer was a small, bird-like man with thin hair and eyes that seemed permanently wide with anxiety. Seeing the marshal's badge glint in the moonlight, Vance's expression shifted from surprise to raw fear. He opened the door wider, ushering Graves inside with a trembling hand, as if inviting a wolf into his den. He was clearly terrified, but it was not the fear of a man caught in a simple crime. It was the deeper, more profound fear of a man trapped between 2 dangerous forces, a man who knew his quiet, carefully constructed world was about to be shattered. He offered the marshal a seat, his movements jerky and uncertain. The marshal remained standing, letting his presence dominate the small, cluttered office. The air was thick with the acrid, metallic smell of acids and scorched metal. Tools of the assayer's trade, scales, crucibles, and tiny hammers lay scattered on a workbench. Graves began slowly, his voice a low, confidential murmur. He spoke of a sensitive investigation, of missing persons and rumors of a sophisticated theft ring operating in the territory. He never once mentioned Silas Blackwood. He was observing Vance, watching the way his eyes darted around the room, the way his fingers twisted a loose thread on his shirt. He was painting a picture of a wide-ranging legal net, implying that any secret, no matter how small, was about to be dragged into the light. He needed Vance to feel that his own safety now depended entirely on his cooperation. Vance, as expected, was defensive. He stammered that his business was entirely legitimate, that he dealt only with licensed prospectors and kept meticulous records as required by territorial law. He offered to show the marshal his official ledger, a book he would have kept clean for just such an occasion. Marshal Graves politely declined. He let the silence stretch, the air growing heavier with unspoken accusations. "Mr. Vance," Graves said, his voice dropping even lower, "I am not here to inspect your public records. I am here because I have reason to believe that you have engaged in private transactions that may be connected to serious crimes. Complicity, even through silence, carries a heavy penalty. The threat, though veiled, was clear. The law was a distant concept on the frontier, but in this small, lamp-lit room, it was an immediate and suffocating presence." The assayer's composure finally crumbled. A thin sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. I don't know anything," he whispered, but the denial was weak, pathetic. It was the last gasp of a man trying to hold back a floodgate. It was then that Graves played his card. "I want to know about the dental gold, Elias," he said, his voice hardening. "I want to know who has been bringing you teeth to melt down." The question hit Vance like a physical blow. His face went ashen, and he slumped back into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. He looked at the marshal with eyes full of a pleading, desperate terror. He tried to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged. The name did not need to be spoken. It hung in the air between them, a guilty, damning specter. Graves simply said, "Show me your real ledger, the private one." With a defeated sigh that seemed to drain the last of his resistance, Vance walked to a heavy wooden desk and knelt down. He fumbled with a key, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit it into the lock of a small, hidden drawer. He pulled out a small, unassuming book, bound in worn black leather. It was no bigger than a prayer book. He placed it on the desk between them, a silent offering, a confession in paper and ink. This was the book that held the truth, the secret chronicle of his most private and most profitable transactions. This was the numerical soul of Silas Blackwood's monstrous enterprise. As Marshal Graves reached for it, He knew he was about to hold the definitive evidence he needed, the irrefutable proof that would allow him to tear down the facade of the town's most beloved citizen. The crinkle of the old leather was the only sound in the room. The marshal opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Elias Vance's neat, precise script, a chilling testament to the banality of evil. Each entry was a simple, factual record. A date, a name or initial, a weight in troy ounces, and the amount paid out. It was the bookkeeping of a legitimate business. Yet Graves knew he was reading a catalog of atrocities. His eyes scanned the columns, ignoring the entries for dust or nugget, searching for a different kind of transaction. And then he found it. The first entry was dated 2 years prior. S.B. Dental gold, 0.8 Oz. Below it, another, and then another. The name, Silas Blackwood, appeared with a sickening regularity, a drumbeat of horror echoing through the quiet accounting. The ledger was not just a record of gold, it was a tally of victims. Graves felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as he absorbed the scale of the operation. He began to cross-reference the dates in his mind, matching them to the known disappearances of travelers and prospectors over the past few years. The correlation was terrifyingly precise. There was a substantial entry for 1.2 ounces of dental gold dated just 2 days after the loud-mouthed cattle merchant was last seen in town. Another entry corresponded with the week a trio of miners passed through, bragging about their strike. The ledger was a ghost story told in numbers, each entry a tombstone for a man whose disappearance had been blamed on the harshness of the frontier. The quantities alone were damning. No barber, no matter how busy, could legitimately acquire this much dental gold. It represented dozens of mouths, dozens of lives, all rendered down into cold, hard cash. The true horror of the ledger, however, lay in its meticulous detail. Some entries were not just for dental gold. Vance, in his obsessive need for accuracy, had made small notations. D, G, crowns, read one. D, G, bridge, intact, read another. And the most chilling of all, next to one of Blackwood's largest deposits, D, G, mixed with bone fragments, difficult melt. The words leaped off the page, a clinical description of a barbaric act. Vance had knowingly accepted and processed evidence of horrific violence, melting down not just gold, but the very bone it had been ripped from. He had been a silent partner in Blackwood's butchery, purifying the profit while turning a blind eye to the cost in blood and pain. The ledger was not merely a record of transactions, it was a signed confession of complicity. Graves finally looked up from the book, his gaze hard as steel. Elias Vance was openly weeping now, silent tears streaming down his face. He said they were from old extractions, Vance whispered, his voice cracking. From Graves. He told me he had a contract to clear old cemeteries. I didn't want to believe, but the gold was always so fresh. Sometimes it was still. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The marshal understood. The gold was sometimes still wet. He's a respected man, Vance pleaded, as if that explained his silence. Everyone trusts him. He's friends with everyone. To accuse him, he would have ruined me, or worse. In that moment, Graves saw the true source of Blackwood's power, not just the sedative and the forceps, but the suffocating weight of his own unimpeachable reputation. While Marshal Graves was uncovering the paper trail of his crimes, Silas Blackwood was conducting his own form of investigation. News traveled fast in a town of that size, and the sight of the washerwoman's terrified son sprinting to the marshal's office had not gone unnoticed. Blackwood, from the window of his immaculate shop, had seen the entire event unfold. He did not know for certain what the boy had found, but the location, the creek behind his shop, left little doubt. A piece of his carefully maintained secret had washed into the light. He felt not panic, but a cold, calculating anger. A loose thread had appeared in the fabric of his double life, and he knew it had to be snipped immediately, before the entire tapestry unraveled. He could not risk a direct confrontation with Graves, but he could target the source of the problem. That evening, as dusk settled over the town, Silas Blackwood walked to the small, humble shack where the washerwoman, Martha Gable, lived with her son. He did not come empty-handed. In one hand, he carried a small paper bag of expensive sweets from the general store, and in the other, a jar of medicated balm he'd prepared himself. For the redness on a washerwoman's hands, he would say. His face was arranged in a mask of gentle, neighborly concern. He was Silas Blackwood, the town benefactor, the kind surgeon, paying a friendly visit. But as he approached the small home, his shadow stretched long and distorted in the fading light, a dark, predatory shape that hinted at the true purpose of his visit. This was not an act of kindness. It was an act of intimidation, a psychological attack designed to ensure silence. He knocked softly. When Martha opened the door, her face a mixture of exhaustion and surprise, Blackwood offered his most disarming smile. He presented the gifts with a flourish, speaking in his calm, melodic voice about his concern after hearing her boy had a fright down by the creek. He entered her small, clean home, his expensive boots silent on the wooden floor. He sat Daniel on his knee, offering him a candy, while he spoke to the boy's mother. His words were a masterpiece of veiled menace. "It's a dangerous world, Martha," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "And children have such powerful imaginations. Sometimes, they can convince themselves they've seen things that aren't there. And idle gossip, you know. It can be so damaging. It can ruin a good man's name. It can even bring trouble to a family that has so little to begin with." The threat, wrapped in a blanket of feigned sympathy, was delivered with surgical precision, and it landed with chilling effect. Armed with Elias Vance's secret ledger, a damning chronicle written in ink and greed, Marshal Graves had the incontrovertible proof he needed. The following morning, he laid the small black book on the desk of the town's circuit magistrate, a man whose worldview was built upon the bedrock of reputation and social order. As the magistrate read, his face shifted from indignant skepticism to a pale, sickly horror. The dates, the names, the chillingly specific notations of dental gold and mixed bone fragments painted a picture of systematic butchery that was impossible to deny. The magistrate's hand trembled as he signed the search warrant. It was more than a legal document. It was the death certificate for the town's comfortable illusions, a formal authorization to unearth a monster they had all called a friend. With the warrant in his pocket, Graves was no longer just a lawman with a suspicion. He was an executioner of a terrible truth. The raid was conducted in the stark, unforgiving light of midday. Marshal Graves, flanked by two hastily deputized and visibly reluctant townsmen, walked the length of the main street towards the barber shop. Their purposeful stride cut through the town's lazy afternoon rhythm, and windows and doorways filled with curious, concerned faces. The bell above Silas Blackwood's door jingled merrily as they entered, a sound of cheerful normalcy that was grotesquely out of place. Blackwood was in the middle of a shave, his hand as steady as ever, the blade held expertly against a client's throat. He looked up, his expression a perfect blend of surprise and welcome. But as his eyes met the marshal's, a flicker of cold, reptilian understanding passed through them. He knew this was not a social call. The time for pretense was over, and the stage was now set for the final cawing, horrifying act of his performance. "Silas Blackwood," Marshal Graves announced, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent shop. "I have a warrant to search these premises." He held up the paper, the magistrate's signature, a dark, official slash. The client in the chair, his face half covered in lather, was quickly and unceremoniously dismissed, stumbling out into the street with a bewildered look. One of the deputies locked the door behind him, transforming the once public space into a sealed crime scene. The air grew thick with a new tension, a suffocating weight that seemed to press down on them. Blackwood, for his part, showed no sign of panic. He calmly wiped his razor, placed it on its stand, and turned to face the lawman. "A warrant," he said, his voice a model of feigned incredulity. "Marshal, there must be some misunderstanding." His composure was absolute, a final, defiant stand of his carefully constructed facade. The search began. The shop was a testament to meticulous order. The bottles of tonic and bay rum were arranged in perfect, gleaming rows. The towels were stacked with geometric precision. The floors were swept clean, the mirrors polished to a flawless shine. It was immaculate, a temple of hygiene and respectability. The two deputies, who had known and respected Blackwood for years, conducted their search with a clumsy, half-hearted reluctance. They opened drawers filled with nothing but neatly organized combs and scissors. They checked cabinets containing only fresh linen and bars of soap. With every empty finding, their skepticism towards the marshal grew, and their belief in Blackwood's innocence was reinforced. The entire establishment seemed to mock the very idea of a dark secret, its pervasive scent of cleanliness, a powerful, aromatic alibi. Marshal Graves, however, was not interested in the shop's superficial tidiness. He knew the filth he was looking for would be hidden far deeper. His attention was drawn to the room's centerpiece, the ornate barber's chair, the throne where Blackwood had presided over his gruesome work. While his deputies searched the periphery, Graves knelt, running his hands over the wide wooden planks of the floor directly beneath the chair's heavy iron base. The area was worn smooth from years of foot traffic, but as he pressed down, plank by plank, he felt it. A minute, almost imperceptible give. One board sat a fraction of a millimeter lower than its neighbors and produced a faint, hollow sound when he knocked on it. It was the kind of detail that 100 clients a week would never notice, but to a man searching for a hidden grave, it was as loud as a scream. Graves retrieved a crowbar from the satchel he had carried with him. The deputies stopped their futile search, watching him with a mixture of confusion and dawning apprehension. The first sound was the sharp splintering of wood as Graves forced the tip of the crowbar into the thin seam between the planks. It was followed by a long, groaning screech as the old hand-forged nails resisted their eviction from the floor joists. The noise was violent, a desecration of the shop's tranquil atmosphere. With a final, shuddering crack, the board splintered and came loose. A puff of stale, musty air billowed up from the dark cavity below, carrying with it a faint but unmistakable odor. It was that same sickly sweet, coppery smell from the handkerchief found by the creek, the smell of old blood and decay, now released from its shallow tomb. Peering into the dark space beneath the floor, Graves saw it. It was not a chaotic jumble of stolen goods or a hastily dug pit. Lying in the dirt was a single, elegant object. It was a finely crafted wooden box, its surface polished to a rich dark luster that seemed to absorb the light. It was made of a dark wood, possibly cherry or mahogany, and was fitted with a small, ornate brass clasp and hinges. The sheer quality of its construction was jarringly at odds with its crude hiding place. It had the appearance of a gentleman's cigar humidor or a case for precious scientific instruments. It was an object to be cherished, a container for something of great value. Silas Blackwood had not simply hidden his secrets, he had enshrined them. This was not a stash, it was a vault. With a grim expression, Marshal Graves reached into the cavity and lifted the box out. It was heavier than he expected, its weight giving it a sense of grim importance. He placed it carefully on the red leather seat of the barber's chair, the very place where so many victims had unknowingly sat. The two deputies, their faces now pale and their earlier skepticism evaporated, drew closer, their eyes fixed on the box. The sounds from the street outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of their own breathing in the tense, silent room. With a steady hand, Graves reached forward and undid the small brass latch. The click echoed like a gunshot. He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for an impact, and slowly, deliberately, lifted the lid, exposing the unadulterated heart of Silas Blackwood's horror to the afternoon sun. The interior of the box was lined with plush, dark blue velvet, a soft bed for the grotesque treasures it held. The sight was a quiet, breathtaking atrocity. Arranged in neat, almost artistic rows were dozens upon dozens of human teeth. They were a macabre mosaic of gold and ivory. Some were perfect, gleaming gold crowns that must have cost their owners a small fortune. Others were cruder, simple gold caps on yellowed, decaying molars. But the clean ones were the minority. Most were horrifyingly imperfect. Many had dark, rusty stains of dried blood caked around their roots. A few, to the marshal's utter revulsion, still had small, desiccated shreds of gum tissue and ligaments attached, a testament to the brutal, tearing force with which they had been harvested. It was a collection, a ghastly catalog of pain and plunder. Throughout this entire process, from the moment the crowbar splintered the wood to the final, terrible reveal, Silas Blackwood had stood perfectly still, watching with an unnerving, almost academic detachment. He had not protested. He had not resisted. Now, as the marshal and his deputies stared in mute horror at the contents of the box, He finally broke his silence. His voice was not that of a cornered criminal, but of a connoisseur explaining his collection. "An impressive tally. Wouldn't you agree, Marshal?" he said, his tone conversational, laced with a chilling thread of pride. "Over 2 years of dedicated work. Each one represents a transaction, a small piece of prosperity transferred to its rightful owner. Me." There was no remorse in his eyes, only the cool, appraising gaze of a collector admiring his life's work. "How?" Graves finally managed to ask, his own voice tight with a disgust so profound it was almost choking him. "How could you do this?" Blackwood smiled, a thin, dry expression that did not reach his eyes. He began to explain his process with the calm, methodical clarity of a surgeon demonstrating a new technique. He spoke of his unique formulation of laudanum, fortified with extracts from henbane and belladonna. "The perfect anesthetic," he mused, "if your goal is not to prevent pain, but to ensure stillness. It paralyzes the voluntary muscles completely. They cannot move, cannot struggle, cannot even scream. But the mind, Marshal, the mind remains perfectly, exquisitely aware." He let the words hang in the air, a testament to a cruelty so refined it bordered on the scientific. He then gestured towards the gleaming brass tray of instruments that had once signified healing and care. "One must have the right tools, of course," he continued, picking up a pair of heavy forceps. "For a simple crown, these are often sufficient. A good grip, a sharp twist, it pops right out." He then picked up a thin, sharp chisel and a small mallet. "But for a deeply set molar, or when the gold is part of a bridge anchored to the jaw itself, a more percussive approach is required. A few well-placed taps at the alveolar ridge," he tapped a spot below his own teeth, "and the bone splinters beautifully. You can then pry the entire section out. The sound is quite distinct, a wet, cracking noise. They hear it all." He described the intimate act of butchery as if he were discussing carpentry. "The gold," Blackwood explained, "was merely the catalyst, the tangible and rational excuse for his actions. It provided the necessary funds to maintain his respectable lifestyle and his supply of chemicals, but it was not his true motivation." As he spoke, his eyes took on a feverish, fanatical gleam, and the mask of the calm collector slipped to reveal the true predator beneath. "You see, Marshal, the real payment wasn't the gold," he whispered, leaning forward conspiratorially. "The real profit was the fear. It was watching the moment of realization in their eyes, the moment they understood the laudanum wasn't for their benefit, the shift from trust to absolute, helpless terror. That is a currency of unparalleled value. That is the treasure I truly collected." In that sickening confession, the man known as Silas Blackwood ceased to exist. The kind neighbor, the trusted surgeon, the pillar of the community. It was all a hollow costume, an elaborate disguise for a creature of unimaginable sadism. What stood before them was a monster who had turned a place of healing into a torture chamber, not just for money, but for the sheer pleasure of inflicting terror. The 2 deputies, who had grown up in this town and had sat in this very chair for haircuts, looked at Blackwood as if seeing him for the first time. One of them turned away and retched into a corner spittoon. The sunlit barber shop, with its pleasant smells and polished fixtures, had transformed into a mausoleum. The case was closed, but the true horror was just beginning to be understood. The trial of Silas Blackwood was less a legal proceeding and more a public vivisection of the town's own soul. Court records from the period document a swift and brutal affair, devoid of the usual legal maneuvering. The evidence was simply too overwhelming, too viscerally horrific to be contested. The small leather-bound ledger of Elias Vance was presented as Exhibit A, its neat columns a chilling account of systematic murder for profit. Exhibit B was the polished wooden box itself, its contents displayed for the jury and the gallery to witness. As Marshal Graves read aloud from Blackwood's detailed confession, a wave of collective revulsion and shame swept through the courtroom. Men and women who had known Blackwood for years, who had trusted him with their health and the well-being of their children, were forced to confront the grotesque reality that they had been living alongside a predator of unimaginable cruelty, and they had never suspected a thing. Throughout the trial, and in the days leading up to his execution, Silas Blackwood remained a figure of chilling, unrepentant composure. He showed no remorse, offered no apologies, and pleaded for no mercy. Eyewitness accounts, later published in territorial newspapers, describe him observing the proceedings with a kind of detached, intellectual curiosity, as if he were a spectator at a play rather than its monstrous protagonist. This sanity, this clear-minded acceptance of his own evil, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his character. He was not a madman driven by delusion, but a rational, intelligent individual who had made a conscious choice to prey upon his fellow human beings for pleasure and profit. His calm demeanor denied the community the comfort of dismissing him as a crazed anomaly. Instead, he forced them to accept a more horrifying truth, that the capacity for such profound evil could reside within a perfectly sound and respectable mind. The day of his public hanging was a stark and somber affair. The entire town, and settlers from miles around, gathered in the dusty square, but the atmosphere was not one of triumphant justice and, as was common with the execution of outlaws, a heavy, suffocating silence hung over the crowd, a collective pall of shame and complicity. They were not just there to see a murderer die. They were there to witness the excision of a cancer they had allowed to grow in their midst. When Blackwood was led to the gallows, he did not cower or curse. He walked with a steady, even gait, his head held high. As the noose was placed around his neck, he scanned the faces in the crowd below, and for a fleeting moment, a thin, knowing smile touched his lips. It was his final, silent message. He had been their creation, a monster nurtured by their own blind trust. His death was not an end, but a permanent stain on their history. The execution of Silas Blackwood did not cleanse the community. It poisoned it. The very foundation of frontier society, the implicit trust between neighbors, was shattered beyond repair. In the weeks and months that followed, a quiet paranoia crept into the town's social fabric. Every friendly gesture, every professional service, was suddenly viewed through a lens of suspicion. Men who had known each other their whole lives now exchanged wary glances. The doctor's soothing bedside manner, the blacksmith's easy smile, the preacher's comforting words, all were now potentially a mask. The case of Silas Blackwood proved that the most terrifying monsters did not come galloping out of the desert with guns blazing. They came with a kind word, a steady hand, and an invitation to sit in their chair. The town had to live with the unbearable knowledge that they had not just been fooled, they had been willing participants in their own deception. The barber shop, once the town's pride, became its open wound. It stood vacant, a monument to a horror they could not ignore. The clean scent of bay rum was replaced by a phantom stench of decay that seemed to emanate from its walls. Children would run past its door, and adults would cross the street to avoid walking on the same side. Court records show that the building was legally seized as part of Blackwood's estate, but no buyer would ever come forward. Then, one moonless night about a month after the hanging, a decision was made. It was not a formal decree, but a silent, communal consensus. Figures emerged from the darkness, carrying torches and cans of kerosene. There was no shouting, only the grim, determined sounds of their work. They were not just vandals. They were exorcists, attempting to purge the evil by fire. The blaze that consumed Silas Blackwood's barbershop was an act of communal fury. The flames tore through the dry timber with a hungry roar, lighting up the night sky and casting dancing demonic shadows across the faces of the silent townspeople who had gathered to watch. The fire burned with an almost supernatural intensity, as if fueled by the town's collective shame and rage. They watched as the ornate barber's chair, the throne of so much agony, was reduced to glowing embers. They watched as the walls that had contained so many silent screams collapsed into a heap of ash and charred beams. They stayed until the roof caved in and the last ember died, leaving only a blackened, smoking hole in the ground where the shop once stood. They had tried to erase the physical evidence of their nightmare, hoping that by destroying the vessel, they could also destroy the memory it contained. But fire cannot burn a story. The physical barbershop was gone, but in its place, something far more permanent began to grow. The legend of the tooth puller, the historical facts of Silas Blackwood's case, the ledger, the trial, the confession, slowly softened and morphed into the more malleable shape of folklore. The story became a cautionary tale whispered by parents to misbehaving children, a local bogeyman to replace the monsters of old-world fables. But this monster was more terrifying because he had been real. The narrative became a warning not against the dangers of the wilderness, but against the hidden darkness within civilization itself. The tooth puller was the man who looked kind but was cruel, who offered healing but delivered torment, who turned a symbol of trust, the surgeon's chair, into an altar of unspeakable violation. The blackened, empty lot where the barbershop once stood became a haunted space, a permanent scar on the town's geography and its psyche. Over the years, stories began to collect around the location like flies to a wound. People claimed that on quiet nights, if you stood near the scorched earth, you could still hear the faint, metallic clink of dental instruments being laid upon a brass tray. Others swore they could sometimes catch a whiff of that same sickly sweet, coppery odor rising from the ground, especially after a rain. It became a place of morbid dares for generations of children, a test of courage to see who could stand the longest on the cursed ground where the barber's chair once sat. The town, which had hoped to forget, had instead created a permanent focal point for its own dark legend, ensuring the story would never be allowed to die. Years passed. The town grew, and the raw wound of the Blackwood affair scabbed over into history. But the poison remained. Long after the last person who had known Silas Blackwood was laid to rest, the story endured. And sometimes, the earth gives up its secrets. The final, definitive image of this tragedy comes not from a historical record, but from a photograph taken in the early 20th century by a land surveyor. It shows a close-up of the charred ground where the barbershop had been. There, half buried in the blackened soil and ash, lies a single object, winking in the sun. It is a human molar, its surface crowned with a dull glint of gold. A forgotten piece of the collection, a final piece of profit, working its way back to the surface. It is a permanent, glittering reminder that no matter how deep you bury evil, a trace will always remain. The story of Silas Blackwood is a chilling testament to the idea that the most profound horrors are not found in the supernatural, but in the calculated cruelty of a human heart. It forces us to ask what is more terrifying, the outlaw in the desert whose monstrous nature is plain to see, or the demon who wears the face of a friend and gains our trust only to violate it. These are the accounts that slip through the cracks of history, stories too dark for conventional archives, but which hold vital warnings. They remind us that vigilance is the price of safety, and that evil often thrives best where it is least expected. To ensure that the darkest chapters of our history are never forgotten, subscribe and help us preserve the Shadow Archive.